So, hello, good afternoon. Thank you everyone who gathered here to discuss Russia, relations with Russia and the West, and to hear out our main guest, I would say a star in a field of those who are studying Russia, because it's my opinion that I doubt that anyone would dare to object that if anyone follows Russia up close as Brian Whitmore. In many circles it's not necessary to introduce Brian, because Brian's work is speaking for itself. To those who do not know, for many years Brian was a journalist. He was working with Radio Free Europe in Prague, where he established a program, Power Vertical, which is now in a platform, on the Facebook platform, right?
It's a blog, it's a video blog and a podcast.
So actually, if you want to learn about developments, nowadays developments in Russia, in a very compact way, you just need to Google Power Vertical and to listen Brian once a week. Currently, Brian is based in Washington, D.C. at a think tank called CEPA, where he leads a Russia program and is also a senior fellow. And we're lucky very much. Organization that I represent is established in Vilnius, Eastern Europe Study Center. We're very happy to partner with CEPA, with Brian, and to have him here. Before we start, I just want to thank our main supporter that enabled us to bring Brian here, to cross the Atlantic and to come back to Europe, to Baltic-American Freedom Foundation. And our topic today is, as you can see over here, is Russia and the West, a new era of conflict. Brian, it was the topic that you actually formulated and suggested. So I give a word to you just to explain what you had in mind within this sentence, and just to briefly present your ideas about events in Russia, how it affects Lithuania, Russia, and most importantly, U.S.-Russia relations, and what is Lithuania's place in it.
Okay.
And then we would open up for questions from you.
Yeah. Well, just be very brief to kind of have more of a discussion here, but I see the inevitability of a long-term conflict right now. I think there's a lot of wishful thinking that we just have this short-term problem with Putin, and we have a Putin problem, not a Russia problem, and that what we're experiencing right now is somehow an aberration from the norm. But I don't think that's the case. I think actually we've gotten Russia completely wrong. We in the policy community in the U.S. mainly, because I think people here in the Baltic states have been getting it right, and we should have been listening a lot more than we were. But we had this assumption at the end of the Cold War. We had this assumption that as Russia integrated with the West, that Russia would adopt kind of Western rules and Western norms and Western modes of behavior in international affairs. We assumed that Western values would take hold in Russia to the extent that we were integrated, and we assumed that Russia could become kind of a status quo player in the international system, a troublesome one sometimes, a difficult one sometimes, but nevertheless a status quo player. This was the assumption throughout the entire 1990s. This was the assumption in my formative years of learning the Russian language, learning about Russia, living in Russia, as I did in the 90s. We all assumed this was going in one direction. We were completely wrong about this. What we've discovered now is that not only is Russia not adopting Western norms, Western rules, and Western values, it is exporting its own values to the West rather successfully right now. It's often shocking to me when I watch the news in the US, and it's beginning to remind me a little bit of Russia in the 90s. So it's kind of shocking to me the extent to which we were not only wrong in our optimistic assessments, we failed to even have the imagination to think that actually Russia would be able to export its way of doing things to the West. And this kind of points to kind of how I see this right now in a global sense. We're not in this Cold War in the traditional sense like we had from 1945 to 1991, where you have these two political, military blocs hermetically sealed, facing each other, facing off against each other with two coherent ideologies. But what we have something a little different now. We have two kind of normative systems operating in the world. And one to the west we're all very familiar with. We learn about it in our civics class. It's based on all these values we hold near and dear, the rights of the individual, the accountability of the government, the sanctity of contracts, the rule of law. And one to the east is based on entirely different things. The subordination of the law to power, patron-client relationships, kleptocracy, the use of corruption as an instrument of statecraft, the marriage of money and power. We have all of these things that we just in the past saw as, oh, these are just the remnants of the Soviet system, that they will go away sooner or later. The conclusion I'm coming to now, and this is the subject of research I'm actually hoping to do pretty soon if I get the funding for it. These are the components of what the great émigré Russian political scientist Elena Ledineva calls sistema. Sistema is more than just a word for system in the Russian language. Sistema refers to this whole complex set of how things get done in Russia. So you will have the outward forms that we could recognize in the West, like parliaments and governments and corporations, but these things don't really function the way ours function according to a set of procedures and norms and rules where these institutions have any real validity. In Russia, these are just a facade. And things are done as they've always been done. The Russian word понятие, everything's done kind of by understanding. Blatné связи, corrupt connections. And this is how it's always been. And to do this research, I kind of decided I had to go back and read a lot of the classics of Russian scholarship on Russian history that I read back in my student days, but it was time to revisit them now with new eyes and fresh experience. And I went back and I was reading, for example, Edward Keenan's classic monograph, Muscovite Political Folkways, which is a study of medieval Muscovy, which was commissioned by the CIA actually in 1986, and has now since turned into probably the most classic text in the English language on medieval Muscovy. And I was reading about how the medieval Muscovite court operated. And what struck me is I could be reading about Putin's inner circle. I could be reading about Brezhnev's Politburo. I could be reading about the court of Nicholas I. But I wasn't. I was reading about the court of medieval Muscovy in the 15th century. And this led me to think this sistema has always been here. This has always existed, and I'm coming to the conclusion that barring some radical social transformation in Russia, sistema will always exist. Things inside of Russia will always be done through these corrupt networks. Corruption will always be a tool of statecraft. Organized crime will always be a tool of statecraft in various forms. We're effectively dealing with a crime syndicate that is masquerading as a state, and that has all the outward appearances of a normal state. There's a parliament, and there's a president, and there's a government, but it doesn't matter, because things are basically run through these corrupt systems. And this wasn't created by Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin basically inherited this in 2000 when he assumed the presidency, and every Russian leader adapts to sistema, and adapts sistema to themselves a little bit. So under Boris Yeltsin, sistema was this very chaotic thing in which clans were all fighting against each other, and there was really no serious central control. Right? Under Leonid Brezhnev, sistema was how the Soviet economy was able to function, because it was the black market economy that kept everything going. If it weren't for the black market economy, people would have been really starving in the Soviet Union. Right? So sistema Putin just adapted sistema to himself and made his little innovations to it, because every Russian leader does kind of make innovations to sistema. But the innovation that Putin made to Sistema, I think, is extremely important. Because what Putin did was he externalized Sistema. He weaponized Sistema. Right? He turned Sistema out against the West. So the corruption that was always used to get things done inside of Russia is now being externalized to create networks of influence in Europe, in North America. It begins in the former Soviet states, and it expands beyond the former Soviet states, which is why I've always been an advocate of pay very close attention to what Russia is doing to its neighbors, because it is what they will be doing to us later, right? Think of the cyber attack against Estonia in 2007. If we had taken that a little bit more seriously in the West, farther to the West, 11 years ago, 12 years ago now, we would not have been so surprised by what happened to us in 2016, right? So I think we must pay very, very close attention. You knew about fake news before it was cool here, because you were dealing with it from almost the moment of your independence, right? And in fact, this is a little aside note, a project I have just applied for funding for. Russian disinformation is very active in Latin America right now. And I've been tracking it, actually. It's very interesting. And the Latin Americans don't know how to deal with this, because it's something very new to them. But the grant proposal we just submitted says, well, people in the Baltic states know a lot about this. So we have this idea to bring Latin American journalists to Vilnius, Tallinn, and Riga to learn from Lithuanian, Estonian, and Latvian journalists about this. And I think this would be a way that the expertise that you have here can be very useful in another part of the world. I talk to Latin American journalists and NGOs about this idea. They love it. We're hoping to get funding for it. But that's just a little aside. I'm adding to this. We're dealing with this sistema now that has been externalized. And there was actually yesterday a great article by Gleb Pavlovsky in Novaya Vremya, New Times, about this. He doesn't put it this way, but he's basically arguing that Putin's succession is now a global problem, that basically Russia is externalizing its domestic politics to the world. And this is another example of this. So during the Cold War, Sistema was contained behind kind of the Iron Curtain. It was sealed in. It was a big problem for anybody, for you all, and anybody that was unfortunate to be on the eastern side of that divide. But it wasn't really a problem for us in the West. But when the wall came down, and we naively were thinking, well, our Western values were just going to spread everywhere, we were blind to the fact that the door opened for Sistema to move its tentacles into our societies. And we see this almost every day. When I see a money laundering scandal at Name Your Bank, Deutsche Bank, Danske Bank, Nordbank, Swedbank, they're happening, I've lost count. This is an example of Sistema moving its tentacles into the West. Nord Stream 2 is an example of Sistema moving its tentacles into the West. It's not just going to pump gas into Europe, it's going to pump corruption into Europe. And I think the Germans need to open their eyes to this a little bit. The Paul Manafort trial in the United States, I was watching this trial unfold. Of course, it was top news in the United States for the past year or so. Another classic example of creating a network of influence. It was working for Deripaska, who is what? Oligarch close to Putin. And surprise, surprise, he tried to change the Republican platform on U.S. policy toward Russia. Right? This again is things getting done by Panyatya, right? I don't think Manafort ever signed some agreement with Deripaska and Putin that yes, if you pay me, I will work for Trump and then I will try to change the Republicans. This is not how everything's done by understanding, by Panyatya, by blatné světy. So this is what we're facing right now, and it is a national security threat. And people are beginning to wake up to this threat, that we are not threatened by Russian tanks, we are threatened by Russian banks. Right? My good friend Michael Carpenter, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, wrote an excellent article in Newsweek this week saying the biggest threat to Europe is not Russian tanks, it's Russian oligarchs. So there is an emerging consensus that this is a problem. And we need to start thinking very hard in the West what we're going to do about this. Right now, we have a sanctions regime in place. But sanctions have been this ad hoc way of dealing with very specific Russian behavior. So Russia annexes Crimea, we put some sanctions. Russia starts a war in the Donbass, we have some sanctions. Russia interferes in the US presidential elections, we have some sanctions. I think we need to move away from these sanctions that are designed to change Russia's behavior, designed to be kind of punishment to change behavior. We have to come to the realization that Russian behavior is not going to change because sistema is not going to change. And as long as sistema exists, sistema is going to try to spread. And so it's just like communism. I mean, I like to say corruption is the new communism because it is spread. And actually, I think corruption is even more dangerous than communism because it appeals to this base human instinct called greed. Right? Communism, at least for all its faults, appealed to some kind of higher ideal. Corruption appeals to the most base human instinct there is, greed. Right? And that makes it very powerful and makes it very dangerous. So we have to figure out a policy. Collectively, the West has to figure out a policy to push back on this. And it's hard to do. Another thing I've been doing is reading about the formation of the Cold War consensus in the United States and Western Europe in the 1940s, and how hard it was to put that consensus together. Those of us that were born into that consensus, I was born in 1963, so like the height of the Cold War, this was already in place. But it's hard to appreciate actually how hard it was for Truman, and Churchill, and Adenauer, and to put this consensus together. That the West had to have this united front against communism, and that this was the battle of our lifetimes. But they were able to do it because communism is an easy kind of monster to scare people with, right? How do you do that with corruption? How do you do that with something so amorphous and hard to understand as sistema, right? This corrupt kind of kleptocratic system. It's hard to get people riled up about kleptocracy as a national security threat. But I would argue kleptocracy is as big a national security threat as communism ever was. Because at least communism was something we could see, we could put our tanks in the Fulda Gap, and we could fight it that way. How do you fight this? It kind of sneaks in through the back door, right? How do you create a system of containment that contains weaponized corruption and weaponized organized crime? How do you know when something's really a threat? I had some interesting discussion with some Lithuanian officials about this, where this seemingly innocuous investment into Baltic Rail turned out, on further investigation, to be a shell company that had links back to Russia, and that there was an attempt to get their tentacles into Baltic Rail, potentially to put malware on Baltic Rail, so Russians could basically stop Baltic Rail at any time. And this would come in very handy if there was a conflict, for example, and we needed to, transport NATO troops to defend our allies in the Baltic states. So but how do you know when something rises to the level of that? How do you know when a social media post called Heart of Texas, that is kind of turning Americans against Americans in one of our largest states, and is creating demonstrations in the same city by the Ku Klux Klan and Black Lives Matter? How do you know when that is actually part of some larger operation by a hostile foreign power to create division, to turn Americans against Americans? It takes a whole new way of thinking. We have to start thinking a lot more creatively about this. We had this thing during the Cold War, we still have it with our nuclear command, called DEFCON. You go from DEFCON 4, which is totally not alert, all the way down to DEFCON 1, which is nuclear war. I think we need kind of a DEFCON system for these non-kinetic threats. So when you have an American businessman with ties to one of our major political parties working for a Russian oligarch and not filing his tax returns, red flags should be going up, saying national security threat, ding, 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 right? This should be happening. It wasn't happening 5 years ago when this was going on. Now we see it, but if this is happening now, these alerts should start going up. We have early warning systems. systems for terrorism. We have early warning systems for nuclear confrontations. We needed early warning systems for this kind of national security threat, because the threat is actually very real. Putin has turned Sistema out against the West and is using it to undermine the West. He's trying to break up the European Union. I think that comes as no surprise to anybody here. He's trying to divide the transatlantic community. He's trying to bring the world back into a world of great powers that dictate to smaller powers. And that, if anybody who lives in this part of the world I know is not really happy to be living in that kind of a world. I think we need to start to think through some things like export bans. We have this wonderful institution during the Cold War called COCOM, Coordinating Committee, which forbade the sale of any dual-use technology to the Soviet Union or its allies. Now today that would effectively mean we're going to take away their iPhones, right? Because an iPhone is certainly dual-use technology. Right? Maybe a new version of COCOM, with export bans, is something we need to think about. Now, Silicon Valley would scream bloody murder if you did this, because Russia's a big market and they want to sell their iPhones there. But, I'm sorry, Silicon Valley did pretty well without the Russian market for many years, and it will continue to do well. Should we be buying and selling Russian sovereign debt? Should we be doing this? I mean, would any respectable bank buy and sell the sovereign debt of a crime syndicate? We are buying and selling Russian sovereign debt, and this is helping finance Russian aggression. Should we be doing this? Let's think hard about that. So I think we need to start thinking about the kind of regulations in our financial institutions and our political institutions that would protect them, that would contain this, because I think we're going to be in this confrontation for a very long time. I think we have to think more broadly about defense. NATO has defense ministers' meetings and foreign ministers' meetings and heads of state and government meetings. I think NATO has to start thinking about having foreign ministers' meetings. Finance ministers' meetings, interior minister meetings, bringing in others that are not traditionally thought of as part of the national security establishment. Because in this world, in this environment we're in now, they are part of the national security establishment. And some research that I've done kind of bears this out. I'm hoping is the start of a much broader study, looking at corruption and organized crime. And I looked at the 3 Baltic states and the 4 Visegrad states. And I looked on one side of the ledger, how much corruption and organized crime is there? And on the other side of the ledger, the dependent variable, if you will, is how successful are Russian disinformation campaigns. And in the Baltics, the results almost matched up perfectly. Right? The Estonians had, and this is according to Transparency International and the World Economic Forum's Organized Crime Index. Estonia has the lowest incidence of organized crime, Lithuania is in the middle, and Latvia has the highest corruption of the 3 Baltic states. Now that said, the 3 Baltic states are better than almost any place else in Europe, quite frankly, right? Better than all 4 of the Visegrad states. All 3 Baltics rank all better than. But in the Baltic, if you look at the Baltics by themselves, that's how it stacks up. Estonia comes in first, Lithuania second, Latvia third. And in the strength of Russian narratives, the tendency for Russian narratives to work, they work the best in Latvia, somewhere in the middle in Lithuania, and the worst in Estonia. So and this is data. I just matched the data up, and it showed me that, okay, yeah, that's because the extent to which you can exploit Sistema. The same thing holds true in the Visegrad countries. The Czech Republic and Poland do better on the index in terms of organized crime and corruption. The Poles are more organized crime but less corruption than the Czechs, and the Czechs vice versa. So they're ranked 1 and 2, but opposite, depending on which one you're looking at. Slovakia and Hungary are lower, and the same thing. The Russian narratives and Russian disinformation campaigns don't work so much in Poland and the Czech Republic. They do work fairly well in Slovakia. In fact, in Slovakia, I was surprised to see that Vladimir Putin has a higher rating than Angela Merkel, which is shocking, quite frankly. But that was the case in Slovakia. So the evidence kind of bears out that the corruption and organized crime are things that we need to be paying more attention to. And I guess I can stop at that. kind of go to questions. I know you wanted to interject. I see you writing furiously. So I'm bringing up some tough questions from the.
Many great ideas, Brian. So first of all, you mentioned at the beginning that Baltics were always right when talking about Russia.
I always say that.
So it's good to hear it again and again because, I would say 8 years back, you would not often actually hear anyone, kind of.
Well, because you have to, this has to be pointed out because we were wrong. We really got Russia wrong from the very beginning, since the end of the Soviet Union, and you were getting them right. You were warning us back in the good old days, back in the Yeltsin period, back when when we were all very optimistic in the West. And we weren't paying attention to the things we should have been paying attention to, like the Bank of New York money laundering scandal in 1998. We should have realized this is a harbinger of things that are going to come later. Or the Mebatex money laundering scandal through Switzerland, and also in the late 1990s. Russia was arming both sides in the Georgian Civil War in 1993-94. But we kind of didn't pay attention to that, right? They were stirring up trouble with the Russian-speaking population in Narva, in Estonia. And we kind of brushed that out. These things are just exceptions, they're not really. But people in all three Baltics know this is the norm. You have to be paying attention to this, and we weren't, and we should have been. And I'm worried about this now because the Kremlin's strategy of the Baltics, it was written up in the Lithuanian National Security Threat Assessment. And I see this myself, is that I think the Kremlin has correctly concluded that they are not going to win any hearts and minds in the Baltic states themselves, but what they can do is divide the Baltic states from the rest of Europe by convincing people in Brussels, in Berlin, in Paris, in London, that you can't listen to them. They're just Russophobic people. You can't, they just naturally hate Russians, and you can't listen to them. So the Russians are going to be trying to convince people in other European capitals right now, as we speak, at this moment, to not pay attention to the crazy things that people in the Baltics are saying. And so I think we really need to keep reminding everybody, but they were right the first time, and we should continue listening. So I think I brought that up for a reason because I read that in the Lithuanian threat assessment. I also read it in Estonia's intelligence review this year. That the whole strategy has shifted. And this is why you're not seeing so many kind of Russian active measures campaigns here as we used to see, because they've shifted their strategy. They've shifted their strategy to Brussels to basically convince people, the people in the larger European states that you can't really listen to the Baltics. They just hate Russians and try to divide you from them, and that seems to be the strategy right now. And so I think that we need to keep saying you were right all along. And then we need to continue listening.
So I just want a little bit to maybe go back to what you've been talking and a little bit to summarize actually all your points. In the topic of our discussion, we have this a new era of conflict. So what type? If we could just summarize, for what are we fighting? Because when listening to you, I kind of heard, values, Western values. So we are defending our values, our rules, the way we're doing things. We're doing things by, following the law, by signing agreements and treaties. While what you presented in Sistema in Russia, so they are doing things just under the table. So if we fight for or we defend values, so our aim is this. But what Russia wants, what I assumed from what you presented, they want to return to the table of big powers. They want influence. So how to win a conflict if we are fighting for different things?
Well, first we do it by defending our values and defending our institutions. And I think this is hard to do right now because the West is going through one of these periodic times of self-doubt. Right? I'm hoping that this period is kind of coming to an end right now, but we are going through this period where we are questioning our own institutions. We're questioning our own values. We've forgotten how to kind of tell our Western story anymore. This has happened for a number of reasons. One reason is that kind of those who have been left behind by globalization are kind of getting angry and feeling that they don't have a stake in the system. We have to find a way to bring those people back in. In this way, the situation very much resembles the 1930s. Then you had a segment of the population left behind by industrialization, and they were ready to support extremist movements of the left or the right, fascism or communism in those days. Today you have this same kind of segment of the population left behind by globalization, and they are prepared to support extremist ideologies of the left or the right. Again, and we all know how the 30s turned out. We don't want a repeat of that movie. I don't think anybody wants a repeat of that movie. And adding to this, you have Russia trying to exacerbate these tensions. The other thing that's going on, I think, is also it's a natural, organic process in the West, where we go through these postmodern periods where it's very fashionable to kind of question everything. Right? And we have this large generation that's coming of age right now that was raised on the X-Files, and everything's a big conspiracy and there's no truth. And this is kind of natural and healthy intellectually, if you're doing it in a university seminar. But when it becomes the way you look at public life, it becomes very dangerous. And a very similar thing happened not in the 30s, but in the 1970s. I grew up in the 1970s, and I remember the last time this happened, when the new left and the new right kind of emerged, and there's no truth, and you question everything. And we went through this natural process. So both of these things are happening right now, right? Both of these things are happening right now. And as these things are happening right now, you have the Russians effectively trying to stoke the fire at the same time. What we need to do is we need to get better at telling our Western story. Some of this is very, very simple. American schools have stopped teaching civics, for example. Just kind of stopped doing it. Stopped teaching Western civilization. Now, I loved Western. It was my favorite subject in school, right? It taught me that our American story is part of this larger story. This was my favorite subject. I loved learning about the ancient Greeks and the Romans and where our institutions and our ideas and our values came from and how they evolved over time. Kids aren't learning this these days. So it comes as no surprise to me that there was just a public opinion poll out. It was the lowest total ever of people that felt it was essential to live in a democracy. I forget the exact numbers, but it was basically people in the 20s, and only like 52% think it's like essential to live in a democracy. Now, when I was growing up, the numbers were like in the 90s on that question. And I rarely saw them go below the 70s. But now it's 52%. I want to ask that other 48%, what do they want to live in? What kind of a system do they really want to live in? How happy would they be in that system? But part of this is the luxury of growing up. It's kind of this postmodern, post-materialist impulse. We go through these things and they pass, but we have to again learn how to tell our Western story to ourselves. Because, and you've heard my spiel about storytelling many times, about how humans are basically storytellers. And it's storytelling that has basically allowed human civilization to even exist, right? Money is just a piece of paper with dead people on it. Unless we tell ourselves a story about that piece of paper with a dead person on it, and then that thing has value, and you can trade it for stuff. Well, the same holds true of our institutions. If we don't believe in our institutions, if we don't believe our story, then our institutions crumble. And again, going back to Russian disinformation and active measures and malign influence campaigns, that's precisely what they're trying to get us to do, to stop believing in our story, stop believing in our institutions. And if I can give another plug to the Baltic states, because, you seem to be, if not immune to this disease that is like sweeping much of Europe and the United States, you seem to have a stronger immune system against this here, because you don't see this kind of existential angst sweeping through. You just had a presidential election. I wish to God we could have an election like that is as boring as the election I just had. I would give anything for us to have an election that's that boring. That there would be two candidates, and I would prefer one, but if the other one wins, I don't think it's the end of the world. Which is basically what just happened here, right? I've kind of been talking to people ever since and before, and I'd love that to be the case. And I think most people in Western Europe would love that. I think the French would love that to be the case, and the Germans would love that to be the case. So you have something here that is another area where the Baltics can kind of be leaders on this, because it is kind of like a breath of fresh air. I remember arriving in Estonia right after Brexit, and I was living in Prague at the time, and I was getting accustomed to all this kind of existential angst that was like Europeans were feeling at the time. And I arrived in Estonia in Tartu in the summer of 2016, right after Brexit, right after the NATO summit. And it was like a breath of fresh air. It was like optimistic and pro-European. And then, so this, I'm not just saying this to flatter my audience. I think there is something very valuable here. I don't know what it is. I wish you could bottle it and sell it and export it to the rest of the Western world. But we do need to learn how to appreciate what we have and to tell that story and to transmit that to others in a way that kind of creates civic pride again, because we're missing this. So that's part of it. But part of it is realizing that there is an external enemy, a hostile power that is actively trying to undermine this. And that if you say this, it doesn't mean you hate Russians and that you're Russophobic. It means that you are objectively looking at what a hostile foreign actor is doing and trying to undermine your institutions. So I think that I think this is doable, but a lot of work has to be done, not just in civil society. And I think our political leadership needs to get better at this. And again, you have leaders here that are doing this extremely well. Your current president does it wonderfully. The Estonian president and the former Estonian president both did it wonderfully. But I think we need more of this. We need more of this in Europe, and we need more of this in North America. I think Justin Trudeau does a very good job of it in Canada. But we need more leadership like this. And the West needs to be unified on this. And we have to have a kind of idea that it has to be a whole of government approach to this. This is a new kind of defense. It's not just something that defense ministries and foreign ministries and security services do. It's all about finance ministries, education ministries, and I was talking about the teaching of Western civilization in our schools. Little things I've noticed in Europe, like in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. I used to live in the Czech Republic. They don't teach history beyond the Second World War. They don't teach in schools, in universities, yes, but in the high schools. They don't teach history beyond the Second World War. And I was flabbergasted when I learned this. And I was asking why. And it was explained to me that, well, the teachers don't really feel comfortable talking about the communist period because they feel complicit in it. And they don't feel comfortable talking about it. I'm like, but you have an entire generation that's gone to school and not learned anything past the Second World War. They've not critically examined the communist period. I mean, I grew up during Vietnam and Watergate. I was a school student, but by the time I got to high school, we were studying that as history. Right? We were studying Watergate and the Vietnam War as history and critically examining it. So which was, I think, helpful and useful and healthy for the society. But so little things like this, I think we need to start paying more attention to. Education curriculum is extremely important. And again, the Finns deserve a lot of credit on this. Their media literacy programs that they have in their schools are great. And I've seen that these things are coming into vogue in the Baltic states as well now, creating kind of media literacy almost from the first grade onward. And this is why the Finns are kind of immune to disinformation because of this.
So Brian, as I understand, the recipe to building resilience is, in addition to institutions, rule of law and tradition of this, it's also actually all population being in a way aware and taking part into a certain, let's say, resilience and resistance. And this would be my argument, actually, what you said, when you wish that your leaders, leaders in the US or decision makers would be doing more or doing as Baltic states. I would argue that in addition to institutions that we have here, we have leadership and we have people who used to live under a system. They are aware about it, And I often find myself thinking, how in a way to teach our Western colleagues to better understand the mindset and the thinking, of Putin, of other similar decision makers, because they do not follow rules. I think the first intention when whatever rule or agreement we make
How
is
do I
to
break
think-
it?
Exactly.
How do I break it? How do I get around this?
Do we want our Western leaders to become this kind of, thinking through both sides, following rules, breaking rules, and then being resilient to the counterparts in Russia?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have to become like them in order to resist them. You've proven that to us, because you were part of Sistema. All three Baltic states were in Sistema, deep inside Sistema. And you've gotten out of it, because now you are more resilient than those of us that were never inside Sistema. Now, there were some that were inside, like Bulgaria, for example, was inside Sistema, but it still has a lot of Sistema in it. Right? Ukraine is fighting very hard to get out of Sistema right now. And I tell them all the time, you're never going to win your war with Russia until you win your war with corruption. They're the same war. They're the same war. One is kinetic, one is non-kinetic, but they're both the same war. And this is what this is all about. Ukraine breaking out of Sistema might just be the thing that breaks Sistema, because the Russians can't imagine, not having Ukraine inside of Sistema, right? So you see varying degrees of countries that were either in the Warsaw Pact or in the Soviet Union breaking out of Sistema. You see, and I witnessed this in the Czech Republic, you see a lot of how they try to keep these ties together and keep the old Stasi networks and the old STB networks together. There was an article in Stern back in 2007, which was a great piece that was looking at how Gazprom Germania became kind of a retirement home for Stasi agents. And it was effectively Putin reactivating his old Stasi network, buying up energy assets in Europe, right? Because through lustration, all your Stasi agents were barred from politics, but they weren't barred from business. And so you see all these different ways the Sistema is trying to continue. You've managed in the Baltic states, by and large, to varying degrees. I still think the Latvians have a little bit more work to do. They get very defensive when I bring this up, and I always have to maybe be careful about saying this in public forums. But I mean, the Latvians do have a little bit more work to do, but they're getting there. They've made incredible strides, especially in money laundering. But the Lithuanians and Estonians have done it's remarkable. I mean, if you look at the corruption perception index, this year, Estonia is less corrupt than America. It's the first time a former socialist country surpassed the United States, and we do pretty well on the anti-corruption. And we're not bad. The Canadians always beat us. We're used to that. But this year, the Estonians beat us. The Estonians are less corrupt than the United States of America, and that's remarkable to come out of Sistema and to be able to do this again. We have to find a way to put this in bottles and export it, because metaphorically speaking. You're right, I don't know the answer to this, but I think there is something here that's going on that we all need to learn from a bit. Because if you look at the map, you're the most vulnerable places as far as the Russian threat is concerned. You're on the front lines. But in the non-kinetic war, you are as safer than anybody, which is pretty remarkable. You have managed to put those defenses up, those non-kinetic defenses. All these things I'm talking about that I think we should be doing, my understanding is that you're already doing them in a lot of ways. I mean, I was briefed by your MOD in their hybrid war room and how they're kind of looking at this. And I've sat down with Estonian intelligence and talked about this. And everybody gets it here, and everybody's doing it. We got to figure out a way to transmit this know-how farther to the West. I mean, I'm organizing hopefully a trip for Latin American journalists here. Maybe some North American journalists can come here too at some point and learn something from you. So.
I wonder if we have questions from the audience. If not now, if we have one, so please.
Yeah, two questions, but you may answer in one answer. First of all, I have the image that Western civilization is reacting too slowly for all all the, I would say, bad things that comes from Russia. Yes, about the war in Georgia and Ukraine, about downing MH17, and we are talking about just about the, some penalty. You do some bad thing, and here's the penalty. And as far as I know from the history, you can talk with Russia when it's weak. You can sit near the table, discuss, talk, agree, and after it becomes stronger, they just, do it their own way. So, first part of my question, why it's so slow for the Western civilization to react, or is it some kind of a plan? And second thing, it takes generation to change that sistema in their minds. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. I mean, one nuclear explosion won't change all this stuff. And it's a long period of that. So how would you suggest to act in the first part of the question? And the second, how would you go away?
The reason it's taken the West so long to wake up to this is because we've basically had a paradigm in place at the end of the Cold War. There was all these assumptions that came into place rather quickly at the end of the Cold War. And they began to take hold during Perestroika. From the moment that Margaret Thatcher met Gorbachev and said, this is a man we can do business with. And from that moment on, as first the Soviet and then the Russian government kind of like made the motions that it was going to play nice with the West, this paradigm came into place, and everybody had a stake in the success of this paradigm. That Russia was just, being integrated into the Western system, and we had to be patient with them because it's a big country with a complicated history and all this stuff. But this paradigm was in place, and so nobody wanted to let go of that and say, "Oh, we're going back to the Cold War," because then you're kind of accused of being a McCarthyite, Cold Warrior, retro. You're not really up with the modern world, right? So it took people a while. It took several shocks that got to move that paradigm, and the paradigm's still not completely shifted. It's I think it's crossed the critical mass. But you had Putin's speech in Munich, you had the cyber attack on Estonia, you had the war in Georgia, and then the war in Ukraine. You take all of these things one after another. Now, looking at them in hindsight, you could see where this was going. But as you're living through this in 2006, 2007. I could see how the political class would say, well, yeah, okay, the Russians did a cyber attack in Estonia. It's not really that big a deal. Okay, they invaded Georgia. Yeah, but isn't Saakashvili crazy anyway? We kept justifying this, right? There were actual debates about, did Saakashvili start the war? How can you start a war when your troops don't leave your territory? Explain this to me, how you started the war when your troops never left your territory. But yet there are people that still, to this day, will argue with me on Twitter that Saakashvili started the war. They will make that argument in seriousness. So it took a series of things. Shifting a paradigm is hard. It's really hard. And so, but I think we're more than halfway there now. I still think, like I said at the outset, there are still people who have these naive wishes that this is just a temporary thing with Russia and we can get back to normal. And I'm trying to convince people, no, this is the new normal, and we have to get used to this from here on out. In terms of how long it takes to change sistema, I used to invest a lot of my kind of intellectual bandwidth in Russia changing. What it's going to take to change Russia. I've kind of I don't want to say given up on that, but it's the order of priority of that is lower for me right now. I think we have to first protect our institutions, protect our allies, protect Western civilization. I think we have to get those like the Ukrainians and the Georgians that have made their choice that they want to be on our side of this divide. We have to help them get there. And I know that's a heavy lift, because try convincing the Italians, the French, and the Germans that the Georgians and the Ukrainians should be in NATO. But I will argue this until the day they put me in the ground. Right? But I think we have to focus on these things and stop worrying about the Russians. The Russians will change when the Russians are ready to change. And if they want to live in a corrupt kleptocracy, that's their business. But they should never be allowed to make their neighbors live in corrupt kleptocracies. Right? You want to live in this corrupt sistema? Пожалуйста. But leave the Ukrainians alone. Leave the Baltics alone. Leave the Georgians alone. They've made their choices. And they are, just like you're free to choose to live in a corrupt sistema, they are free to choose not to live in a corrupt sistema. And so I think this is where we have to place our energy. And I think, just like George Kennan argued about the Soviet Union with containment, if we contain this sistema into the borders, the current borders of the Russian Federation, I think it will wither and die eventually. Right? I think that's how we're going to have to do it. Now, that's not great for the Russian people, and I have very kind of emotional conversations with my Russian friends about this, but I'm through trying to change Russia. Every time you do it, you get blamed for interfering in their internal affairs, and you get called an imperialist and a gringo and a Yankee. You know, fine, have your sistema and live with it. Change it if you so choose, but we're going to protect ourselves and our allies from your sistema, and see how well this thing does when it's cut off from the global economy. Because this is the problem right now: is we're allowing Putin to have it both ways. We're allowing sistema to have it both ways, where you get all the benefits of the global economy, right? You're able to buy and sell your sovereign debt on the international financial markets. You have access to international markets, import, export. You're treated like a respectable member of the world economy when you're a crime syndicate. You get to behave like a crime syndicate and pretend that you're a respectable.
You're talking about Russia or Russian leadership as crime syndicate,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And here was also when presenting the question, it was mentioned that Russia is willing to talk when it's weak.
Mm-hmm.
So are you one of those who would support dialogue and talking with Russia, especially, for example, recently Russia was brought back to Council of Europe,
Mm-hmm.
right?
I oppose that.
You oppose
I
that,
oppose
okay.
that.
So how do you see what engagement, official one, and here I'm reading now, we're here in a very nice building, Odessa and Saint Petersburg, library, museum, so leadership, presidential leadership, right? At the beginning you kind of, you said it's, we're facing not Putin, but Russia problem, so you kind of minimize Putin as, the actor in this problem, but then I want to ask you about the US President Trump. He had a meeting with Putin, right? So he engaged in the conversation. And you said you're against such involvements as Council of Europe, via institution, like this one institution. So in general, how do you see this political level engagements we have, and what would be your main observations? What is correct? What's not, and Estonian president recently met Putin. So in all kind of this kind of bubble that we live in,
right?
What communication channel should be correct? And is Russia now willing to talk, meaning it's weak, or it's not willing to talk and it's powerful?
It wants it both ways. It wants to be treated like a respectable member of the international community while it is continuing to be allowed to act like a crime syndicate. I'll hit these one at a time. First, the Council of Europe. Yeah, I was in favor of just letting Russia take its toys and go home. I mean, its voting rights in the Council of Europe were suspended for a reason, because it annexed its neighbors' territory. Now, we're going to allow them back in after annexing their neighbor's territory? That's kind of like saying, well, that's okay. Sorry. So in the Council of Europe, again, this is for Europeans to decide. I'm not an EU citizen, but, the way I understand the Council of Europe, it's the main human rights organization in Europe. And really, we're going to let Russia be a member in good standing of this organization? This country that assassinates people with, polonium in London, we're going to allow them to be a member of the most respected human rights organization in Europe. So when Russia was threatening to leave the Council of Europe outright if their voting rights weren't restored, if I were in charge, I would have said, bye-bye, have a nice trip. See you when you come back to your senses. In terms of whether we should be talking to Russia, it depends what we're talking about. I mean, I'm not in favor of having negotiations with Russia about Ukraine's sovereignty. That's just not something we should be having a conversation with Russia about. We have a very sad history of when big powers talk to each other about the sovereignty of small powers, right? You know, we don't have to go into great detail about Munich or about Molotov-Ribbentrop to talk about where that kind of thing leads. So I just don't think we should be having discussions with Russia about Ukraine's sovereignty. And that's what Russia, at the end of the day, wants to talk about. They couch it in this, we want to have a different kind of international system where we have a privileged sphere of influence in the former Soviet space. Well, I'm sorry, that's a discussion about Ukraine's sovereignty.
So on which topics you would support dialogue with Russia?
To prevent accidental conflicts, like military to military, certainly. Very practical, technical things like this, I think we should be having discussions with them. But in terms of these larger issues of the international system and the Ukraine conflicts, no. I don't see what the point of talking about this. Because again, we're discussing something with what they want to talk about are things we really have no right to negotiate about. It's other people's futures we're talking about. They want to talk about the right of Ukraine to be a sovereign state, the right of Georgia to be a sovereign state. Why should we be talking to them about this? So I would say, no, we don't want to talk about that. Yeah, we'll talk mill to mill to make sure there's not some kind of nuclear accident between us. Yeah, definitely. Let's do that. We did that at the height of the Cold War, and I'm in favor of us doing it today. If we want to have some kind of arms control agreement, yeah, we can have a discussion about that. But only about these very specific things, but to have discussions about, again, Ukraine's sovereignty, and that's what they want to talk about, make no mistake. They want to talk about their neighbor's sovereignty. They don't put it in those terms. They talk about a kind of reforming of the European security architecture. Now, they put it in this like fancy language. What it means is they want their sphere of influence, which means they want their empire back. And this is very dangerous for everybody. Because if we start down that road, we know where it leads. Because every single Russian imperial project begins with Ukraine. But no Russian imperial project ends with Ukraine. It begins to move farther north and farther west from Ukraine after Ukraine is gobbled up. So I think we have to be very careful about this. In terms of, I know everybody's asking about the Estonian president's visit. I was kind of puzzled by it. I don't know what her motivations are. I do know when, you do have to have some kind of relations with your neighbors. Everybody's not so fortunate as to get to live next door to Canada. I get that. I'm very grateful that we get to live next door to Canada because they're the most wonderful neighbor in the world. But I understand everybody cannot be so fortunate. And as far as our president's meetings, it's hard to assess them because nobody knows what went on in those meetings. Nobody knows what actually went on. So it's hard to even discuss them. But what we do know is what U.S. policy is. And U.S. policy has been as tough as ever. So I think something's working with the foreign policy establishment. It's keeping our policy in a specific place. But it's hard to speak to our president's meetings. We don't know what was talked about. And it doesn't appear to have translated into any actual policy actions. The situation is a little unusual right now, to say the least.
Do you have more questions from the audience? I want to ask you maybe one of the last questions, as we agreed to that this event would take only 1 hour. So basically, if I would need to close up the discussion, and you usually look into the future, what's the perspective. I'm not going to ask who's going to be leading next after Putin, but I want to refer to the future, and the future is youth. You very often in your discussions mention that now Russia has a new generation, generation which grew up under one and the same president. And what type of picture of this youth you have, through talking with your colleagues in Russia, for example, and how do you see, could that change be led Yeah, we have Navalny as well.
Yeah,
I wanted
no.
to bring it up.
Yeah, no, there's, my colleague Maria Snegovaya at CEPA is actually doing research on this, on the Russian generation. Maria is much more optimistic than I am about this. What I see right now, and you're right to point out, you have a generation that's already come of age that's known no other president other than Putin. By the time I was 18 years old, I had lived through the presidencies of Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan. Right? 6 presidents. I'd seen 6 presidents, and they've seen 1, because Medvedev doesn't count. It really it doesn't. And so but what you have in Russia right now is a very paradoxical situation. You have this desire for change. You definitely have a desire for change. You see this in the protests in Ekaterinburg, in Arkhangelsk, and elsewhere. You see this in Putin's falling popularity. The trust in Putin is at an all-time low. His rating now is below where it was right before Crimea was annexed. So the kind of Crimea effect is worn off. You have this desire for change. Change into what? We don't know. And there's also this realization that there isn't a possibility for change. Everybody kind of understands that the regime has got, its instruments of repression in place to basically shut down any attempt at change. So you have this desire for change, but a realization that change isn't going to come. And so what we're going to see is one of 2 things: a protracted period of stagnation, kind of a second Brezhnev period, if you will, or at some point a complete system breakdown. Those are the only 2 possibilities I see. And I'm not, I don't like to make predictions, especially about the future, as somebody once said, but I don't know which of those 2 it's going to be. My guess would be a protracted period of stagnation. And we're going to see this generation grow up and become increasingly disillusioned, because this generation does want change. It absolutely wants. Now, what it wants to change to, it doesn't necessarily want to change to kind of a European style of democracy. Right? These people are following Navalny, who is a complicated character. I mean, what I think the positive side of Navalny is he's encouraging Russians to think about themselves as citizens rather than as subjects. He uses that kind of language, and he encourages people to think of themselves as citizens, people with agency, can affect their future. He's also quite a Russian nationalist, right? I think he wants a kind of a prosperous, liberal, democratic society for ethnic Russians. But I'm not sure how he feels about non-ethnic Russians. So this is another thing. On the issues of Crimea and Ukraine, he certainly hasn't sounded very, very liberal to me. So Navalny's a mixed bag. And this generation is a mixed bag. It wants change, but that doesn't necessarily mean it wants the kind of change that you and I associate with democratic change. So, and it also, again, this realization that the possibility for real change to happen has really been closed off. So I expect us to be going through just a protracted stagnation. Now there's these kind of technical matters of how the elite is going to deal with what they call the 2024 problem. Right? How do you keep Putin in power? Because Russia, the heart of the political issue is that they don't have a succession principle, right? I mean, we have succession principles. You have a succession principle. You just had a presidential election. I have no doubt that the sitting president will step down, the new president will come in, it'll all be done very peaceful and civilized. This is like science fiction to the Russians. This doesn't happen in Russia, right? So they have to keep, each presidency as it nears its end, reaches this crisis point where you have to figure out what to do. I remember this toward the end of the Yeltsin presidency. And they came up with all these mechanisms to do something, right? And the result was Putin. Same thing's going to happen again. There's going to be this kind of scramble to come up with some kind of succession principle at the end of Putin's next term in office. It might be this Anschluss with Belarus, which would be a security nightmare for Lithuania. If you think about that. That's your worst case scenario. You basically bring Russia right up to your borders, right? You don't want to see that. There's a possibility of constitutional change to create this kind of Chinese model state council, in which kind of Putin would become the kind of the great leader for life, and you would have presidential elections, but they wouldn't matter if the president really wouldn't be in charge. So they're trying to come up with some kind of a mechanism, and I expect that they will come up with some kind of a mechanism. That's a technical question, but I expect he's still relatively young. He's 64. Appears healthy. No reason to believe he can't stay around for another 15 years or so. I expect, and that spells stagnation. It's like the Zastoi, as they call it in the Brezhnev period. And I think I expect Putin to kind of transform into Brezhnev. That would be my prognosis at this point. Maria, my colleague, is much more optimistic about this young generation. She is a very westernized member of this young generation who is now going to be a U.S. citizen soon. She's kind of out of Russia, but she's very optimistic as a scholar about this, and she's doing a lot of research into it, and I respect that, and I hope she's right, and I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think so. I think I'm right, unfortunately, and I'd rather be wrong.
The latest research that I was at Leonard Mary conference like a week ago in Tallinn, one of major topics was still Russia and the focus on youth. And one of researchers actually, in a way, confirmed what you're saying, but also to add up saying that the current youth in Russia is more closed in, thinking within Russia borders. If before they wanted they were more exposed or looking into West as something, you could say American dream or Western dream or Western lifestyle or something. So now they kind of lost interest, lost hope maybe of having that. And I'm not here to agree with you, also not to disagree, but they kind of think that what you've been talking about stagnation in this generation, I fear that majority might confirm what actually you've been saying. And if to ask you, we don't have much time, but just help me to close our discussion. I feel at the end that we raised more problems than we found solutions. We agreed that Baltics are doing well and showing very good results, and especially Estonia. Well, as Lithuanian citizen, I still need to give my, all the applause to Estonian brothers and sisters. So, if to close up in a 3 points, one of them needs to be optimistic. Okay. So one optimistic point, what to continue doing and what we're doing very well. And then another 2 points, what else should be done and who should be doing it and how. Something more like concrete, You mentioned many things, but what would be like 3 main things? Or give it 2, it's up to you.
Well, I think we need to restore confidence in the Western system. I think that is job 1. I think we really need to, as I said earlier, learn to tell our Western story better, and kind of get through this period of angst that we're in, recognize that we've been here before, and we can learn from the times that we've been here before. I think we need to find a way to bring in those marginalized people that are kind of voting for extremist parties on the left and the right in both Europe and North America. I think we have to figure out how to bring them back in. Now, we do have history to teach us and guide us a little bit on this. In the 40s, after the experience of the 30s, what Western Europe and the United States did in the 40s was they created basically a social safety net and social welfare structures that, now when I say this, my friends on the right begin to get really nervous, but this is not a political statement, but this worked. This brought the working class into the middle class. It basically stopped them from basically supporting communist parties, effectively. It saved capitalism, if you will. Now, this was the 40s. It was a different kind of an economy. than we have today. And how to do this in a globalized world economy where capital can move so quickly and it's going to move where it's taxed less. It's harder to create that kind of social safety net that you had in the 40s and 50s. But we have to find some analog, some way to give this part of the population who feel that they are the losers of globalization. Because I don't think the solution to this is to stop globalization and close our borders and put up trade barriers and things like that. I don't think that, we cannot go back to that economy again. We've moved kind of too far down the road. That horse has left the barn. That train has left the station. So how do we figure out a way, and I don't have the answer to this. I think there's a Nobel Prize in economics out there waiting for somebody who can figure out the answer to this question. But how do you bring these people back in? So that's another thing I think we need to do. And the third thing we need to do is to build consensus that there is indeed a hostile outside power that is trying to undermine our institutions. We have to build consensus. We need the functional equivalent of Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech right now. We need something like that. And again, how to do that in this day and age, because again, society is different than it was in the 40s. And I wonder if Churchill himself could rally, this kind of postmodern, angst-ridden, individualistic West right now into this kind of this realization that we are in a systemic struggle. And I don't want to live in a corrupt authoritarian kleptocracy. I know you don't want to live in a corrupt authoritarian kleptocracy because you or your parents were forced to against their will. I choose not to live in that. I don't want to live in that, and so the only choice is to defend our institutions, to get that message out to broader populations that we are in this kind of a struggle. And I haven't even talked about China, because there's another issue on the table, the big elephant in the room here, and this is one of the driving forces behind the whole 2% debate, right, in the US. Among the kind of more thoughtful people that are making this argument about burden sharing, is that out of necessity, the United States is going to have to shift a lot of its resources to Asia to confront a rising China. This is the feeling in the Pentagon. And this is with the realization that the Russia threat is not going to go away for Europe. And so we have to make sure that Europe can defend itself, not with no America, but with less America in the equation. And this is what's really, the more thoughtful people talking about burden sharing and 2% and all of these things. What's really driving that is a realization that we are going to have to shift our resources east to deal with China, which is what, the way the Pentagon puts it is we have to be ready for a kinetic confrontation with a near peer very powerful competitor. That's code for we need to be ready for a war with China, potentially.
So
and so when that happens,
you close up with something
positive. I worked on that. I'm sorry, I figured we had to bring that elephant in the room at some point. But no, the other two things I think we can do. We've been in this place before. We have history to guide us right now.
So that's the optimistic. We have history.
We have history to guide us, and we've been here before, and we've emerged. I mean, I grew up in the 1970s. We were certain that Western civilization was at its end, and that the United States was falling apart. And we were losing the Cold War, and the Soviet Union was going to take over everything. This is what I grew up, this is what the feeling in the angst-ridden United States in the 1970s.
That sounds very scary.
Well, yeah, but guess what? It didn't happen. Because the 70s turned into the 80s, and we all know what happened. Now, so I have every reason to believe that we can get through this again, that Western civilization is more resilient than it appears to be at this moment.
So I think now we need to stop, because you actually said very optimistic thing. That's not
I'm an optimist at heart. I am an optimist at heart.
And we kind of felt, during this discussion that we getting, finding that consensus. That US, the Euro, Baltic states, we also have, countries that kind of pro-Russia. But still, at the end, EU sanctions against Russia is still there.
Yep.
And we have US. Even you mentioned, the shift to Asia again. We had
Yeah.
one wave of shift to Asia,
Yeah.
and then you got back to Europe.
Yep.
So let's see how it happens, in the next
Well, the
years.
US is never going to leave Europe. That's impossible. But there will be, resources are finite. And there's a realization that this shift is going to have to happen. It won't be, I don't think, as dramatic as a lot of people think, but I think we have to be ready for the possibility of that. And I think it's in everybody's interest that Europe is able to defend itself with less, not with no America, with less America. And I think that's good for everybody concerned.
And I think it's possible.
And I think it's possible too.
So maybe we stop here.
Okay.
We thank our audience, and let's thank to our hosts here at the
Yes.
library, Vladas, and let's hope that we will be back here, that you will be back here.
I'll always be back. You're
And
never
then we
get rid
will
of me.
be talking, about some, let's say, positive,
Yes.
more of positive progress.
Okay, I hope, we hope we will see some positive progress, and you will be coming to Washington to teach us about the Baltic experience and
Definitely,
fighting
and
Baltic
all
fighting.
Latin American
And we're
journalists you want us to
gonna-
teach.
If we get the money for that, we'll do that.
Definitely. So thank you